Who made these decisions and when did they make these decisions? Great question. And I would once again love to tell you that we have rabbinic writings from this time period that just blanket tell us. We're going to start with the Old Testament in this case. Starting with the Old Testament. Who made the decisions over which books are in and which books are out of the canon? Not necessarily which books are read and which books are not read, but the rabbis in the Talmudic period would refer to a book as making the hands clean or making the hands unclean. In other words, this book was so holy that it could actually make your hands unclean, and you had to then go through a spiritual ceremony to make your hands clean again. Versus books that don't make your hands unclean. In other words, kind of like some of our books today, you think of The Purpose-Driven Life. Is it a good book? Yes. Is it scripture? No. Those are some of the same kind of concepts that we realize the Jews were talking about, were thinking about. And now, maybe you've heard about the Council of Jamnia. The Council of Jamnia happened in 90 AD. Rabbis got together near Jamnia, and they are about 20 years after the destruction of the temple. And they're trying to figure out, without temple and without Jerusalem, how do we do Judaism? What does Judaism mean without a temple and without Jerusalem? And so that's what's going on at the Council of Jamnia. We know that the rabbis had discussions about books, specifically Proverbs, Ezekiel, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. Were all discussed at Jamnia. Is it real or is it not real? But the Council of Jamnia did not issue any kind of what we would consider church council getting together and making a pronouncement. Jews don't think like that. You've got to remember that here, during the Second Temple period, we had Sadducees and we had Pharisees. We had people who say there is a resurrection and we had people who say there isn't a resurrection. Now, is that a small detail or is that a big detail? I would call that a big detail in my Christian mind, and yet the Jews don't see that. They see the Sadducees and the Pharisees both as Judaism. So at the Council of Jamnia, they haven't changed that kind of thing. They're not about to make some sort of definitive pronouncement. Once again, we know they discussed these books, and we know that they accepted these books. In Daniel chapter 9 verse 2, so Daniel, sometime here at the end of the 6th century BC, he writes that in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books. Now the word books here is the same word that we find in other Jewish sources, such as the Mishnah. This word refers to the scriptures. So, during this time period in the 6th century, Daniel is saying that I got out my Bible and I looked in my Bible. He goes on to mention Jeremiah. Jeremiah is early 6th century. So by the time of Daniel in late 6th century, Jeremiah has already been received as canon in the Jewish mind. Now before I go any further, I do want to acknowledge the Maccabean theory regarding Daniel. That is the idea that Daniel is not written in the 6th century. It's written by the Maccabees sometime in the 2nd century. This is a very popular theory today. I want to draw your attention to the work of Kenneth Kitchen. Kenneth Kitchen has done amazing work on this subject, refuting the arguments that because Daniel has borrowed Persian words and borrowed Greek words, he must be late. Kenneth Kitchen has gone into why that's not a problem. He's using Old Persian words and he's using trading Greek words. That is, words that could have infiltrated all the way to Persia from Greek by that time period. So basically I want to acknowledge that the writing of Daniel is controversial, but I want to point you towards a source that argues for the very early date of Daniel. Now, did I just use a circular argument? Did I just try to prove the Bible with the Bible? No, that's not what I just did. What did I do? I referred to a later document that's referring to an earlier document. And this later document is saying that this earlier document is already accepted by this late period. You actually see this throughout the biblical narrative, that the younger writers refer to the older writers, implying that the younger writers already accept the older writers as authoritative. So it does not count as a circular argument. These books, the deuterocanonical books found in the Catholic Bible, we may not accept them as scripture. They come from the intertestamental period. The intertestamental period is simply the period the Old Testament ends, the New Testament begins. So this is the intertestamental period. And we can look at these as Jewish sources. Historical Jewish thought during this time period. And that's all I'm doing by referring to these books this morning. In the prologue to the book of Sirach. The book of Sirach is also sometimes called the Wisdom of Jesus. Don't think Jesus New Testament. Think Jesus as the Hebrew word or Hebrew name Joshua. It's also sometimes called the Son of Sirach. It's also sometimes called Ecclesiasticus. You can see why they don't want to call it Ecclesiasticus, because we have Ecclesiasticus and we have Ecclesiastes. Both very interesting words, both very easy to go between them, right? So we refer to this as the book of Sirach. And in the forewords before he writes, he says that the law and the prophets and the other writings have left us a wealth of value. He's writing in about 132 BC. So he's writing here in the 2nd century BC. And he just referred to the law, the prophets, and the other writings, which is the threefold division of the Jewish scriptures. You have the law of Moses, the Torah, the Pentateuch. You have the prophets, both the early prophets and the latter prophets. And you have the writings. And he just referred to them here in the 2nd century. Meaning that by this time period, in the 2nd century, the Jews already had this concept of we have the law, we have prophets, and we have the other writings. He goes on. Now here I think I'm quoting something much closer to a King James version versus this version. Since many great things have been delivered to us through the law and the prophets and the other writings who followed after them. Once again, he's referring to this threefold division. Now, which is more likely? That he, writing here in the 2nd century, just invented this, or he's writing what he was taught at Sabbath school? It's more likely, if you ask me, that he's not inventing something. It's more likely that he's just referring to something that he already learned from his Sabbath school teacher, right? One more point and then we'll take our break. Sound good? Later in the book of Sirach, beginning in chapter 45, he refers to Moses. And then he refers to Aaron. Then he refers to Phinehas. Who's Phinehas? Aaron's son?
Oh, yes.
He refers to Phinehas. Then he refers to Joshua. Then he refers to Caleb. He goes on and refers to the judges, Samuel, Nathan, David, Solomon, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, Elijah. What did he just show us? He just showed us that he is very familiar with the chronological order of the Jewish Bible. Once again, is it more likely that between these chapters he's just inventing the order, or is he just saying that by this time period the order is already established? It's more likely that the order is already established by this time period. One final reference from the deuterocanonical books regarding the Jewish idea regarding the canon during this time period, the intertestamental period. We have the book of 2nd Maccabees. The Maccabean revolt happened in 167 to 160. That's where they got tired of the Seleucid Empire in Epiphanes 4 outlawing Judaism. And so Judas Maccabees, his dad, his brothers, they lead the Maccabean rebellion. That's where we get Hanukkah from. If you've ever wondered where Hanukkah comes from, it comes from the Maccabees. But anyways, the Maccabean... Second Maccabees, it's just once again another historical document from this time period. And in chapter 2, the author is writing to other Jews experiencing the beginning of the Jewish independent time before the conquering of the Romans in 63 BC. He's writing to a particular group and he's talking about all sorts of things in this chapter, but he specifies that during the time of Nehemiah, so here at the beginning of the Second Temple period, Nehemiah had collected the works of the kings. Let me read from up here. The books about the kings, the prophets, and the books of David, and also the letters of the kings. What this probably refers to when we're talking about the books about the kings would probably be Joshua through what we would call 2 Kings, because that's the way the Jewish Bible does things. One, you don't get 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, you don't get 1 Kings, 2 Kings in the Jewish Bible, and you don't have Chronicles following Kings. Chronicles comes at the end of the writings. But anyways, here he's referring to the kings, the prophets, which probably refers to that collection of scrolls called the prophets, and the books of David, which would of course be the Psalms, but that's probably another way to refer to all of the writings. And when it comes to the letters from the kings, that's probably a reference to Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah come with letters from the kings saying we get to rebuild Jerusalem. So once again, by this time period, they already understand that there's a collection of Scripture, and there's other books that aren't that collection. He goes on to tell whoever he's writing to, if you need copies of these books, Judas Maccabees has collected these books, we can get you copies of these books.